There is a soldier's patch from the Second World War that makes no sense the first time you see it. No eagle, no lion, no sword, just a snake. A green snake coiled up and smoking a pipe. A little curl of smoke rising from its mouth, calm as an old man on his porch. Tens of thousands of soldiers crossed an ocean with that ridiculous cartoon stitched onto their sleeves, and they wore it with more pride than any flag. Why? Because that snake is an insult. It's an insult that a whole country was supposed to swallow, and instead they sewed it onto their uniforms, picked up their rifles, and carried it all the way to the mountains of Italy to shove it back down the throats of the people who said it. So before we're done, I'm going to tell you how a snake learned to smoke. My name is Joaquim. I taught history in a Brazilian classroom for almost 40 years, and if there is one story my students never forgot, it's this one because it's the story they were never told. You will not find it in your school books wherever you're sitting right now. The Americans tell their war. The British tell theirs. The Russians, the Germans. But there was another army in that war, an army from the tropics that nobody expected to show up at all. Pull a chair closer. Let me tell you about the smoking snakes. To understand the joke, you have to understand where Brazil was in 1942. Picture it. The biggest country in South America, enormous, sunny, far away from the trenches of Europe. And honestly, most Brazilians wanted nothing to do with that war. It was a European mess, an ocean away. We had our own troubles. The country was run by a man named Getulio Vargas, and I want you to remember that name because he matters at the end of this story in a way you won't see coming. Vargas was a dictator, a clever one. He had taken power and shut down the elections, and he was doing a very dangerous little dance, smiling at the Americans on one side and smiling at Hitler's Germany on the other, selling his coffee and his cotton to whoever paid best, trying to stay out of the fight and squeeze both sides for everything he could get. And the Brazilian people, they had a saying. Oh, they loved this saying. Whenever somebody suggested that Brazil might actually send soldiers to fight in Europe, people would laugh and say, "It's more likely that a snake will smoke a pipe than Brazil sends its army into this war." Think about what that means. A snake smoking a pipe, that's their version of when pigs fly. It was a national punchline. The idea of Brazilian boys marching through the snow of Italy was so absurd, so impossible, that it became the thing you said when you meant never. Never going to happen. A cold day in a place we don't have cold days. A snake with a pipe. Remember that snake, because somebody was listening. Now here is where the laughing stopped. While Vargas was playing both sides, there was a problem out in the dark water off the Brazilian coast. German submarines, U-boats. You probably picture them hunting in the cold North Atlantic near Britain, and they did. But Hitler's submarines also slipped south, down along the warm coast of Brazil, and they were sinking ships. Not just warships, cargo ships, passenger ships. Ships full of ordinary Brazilians who had no idea there was a war anywhere near them. In just a few days in August of 1942, a single German submarine, it was called U-507, moved along the coast near the states of Sergipe and Bahia, and it sank ship after ship after ship. 5 of them in barely 2 days. One was the B. Pendy, carrying soldiers and families. Another was the Araraquara, another the Aniba Benevolo. When the counting was done, more than 600 people were dead. 600 Brazilians, drowned in the warm water you could swim in off your own beach within sight of home, by an enemy most of them had never thought about for a single day of their lives. Mothers, children, whole families. The bodies came ashore on the beaches of the Northeast. And let me tell you what happens to a joke when the bodies wash up on your own sand. It dies. Overnight, the laughing country became a furious country. People poured into the streets. Students marched. They were not asking Vargas to stay neutral anymore. They were demanding the opposite. They were screaming for war. And here is one of those quiet little ironies that history loves. The dictator Vargas, who had spent years avoiding this exact decision, he didn't push the country into war. The people pushed him. On the 22nd of August, 1942, Brazil declared war on Nazi Germany and its allies. The snake, it turned out, was reaching for its pipe. Now, you might be asking the same thing my sharper students always asked. Professor, fine, Brazil was angry. But why would the Americans even want them? What could Brazil possibly give to a war being fought on the other side of the world? And the answer is a thing most people never learn. Look at a map of the Atlantic Ocean. Look at the northeastern corner of Brazil, that shoulder of land that juts out toward Africa. That corner around a city called Natal is the closest point in all of the Americas to the other side of the ocean. And in a war, closest means everything. The Americans built airfields there, enormous ones, and Natal became one of the most important airports on the planet that year, a stepping stone, a launching pad, where American planes and supplies hopped across the narrowest stretch of the South Atlantic on their way to the fighting in Africa and Europe. The Brazilians had a name for it that I think is just perfect. They called it the trampoline to victory. A trampoline, you bounce off it to get somewhere higher. Half the air power crossing to that side of the war bounced off the shoulder of Brazil. So President Roosevelt himself came down to Natal in 1943 and sat with Vargas, and they made a bargain. The Americans would get their bases, their trampoline, and in exchange, Brazil would get modern weapons to build a real army and help building the great steel mill the country dreamed of, to drag itself into the modern age. Vargas, the old fox, even at the door of war, was still trading. But this time the thing he was building was an army that was actually going to fight. But declaring war and fighting a war are two very different animals, because now Brazil had to actually do the impossible thing. It had to build an army capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean and standing in a line next to the Americans and the British against the German war machine, the most feared army on earth. And Brazil, I have to be honest with you, was not ready. The army was small, under-equipped, trained for parades and border patrols, not for the mud and steel of a world war. Nobody believed they could do it. Not the Germans, not the Americans, who frankly expected very little, and plenty of people back home in Brazil didn't believe it either. There was that saying again, hanging in the air: a snake will smoke a pipe before these boys ever see combat. So the men who volunteered, and they came, farm boys and city boys, from the coffee fields and the coastal towns, most of them having never seen snow, never seen Europe, many having never left their home state. Those men did something I find absolutely beautiful. They took the insult. They took the thing that was meant to mock them, the snake that would never smoke, and they made it their symbol. They formed the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, in Portuguese the Força Expedicionária Brasileira, the FEB, and on their shoulder they put a patch of a green cobra smoking a pipe. You said a snake would smoke before we fought. Fine. Here is the snake. Here is the pipe. Watch us. They started calling themselves the Cobras Fumantes, the smoking snakes, and there was a phrase that went around, half a threat and half a promise: the snake is going to smoke, which meant trouble is coming and we are bringing it. Back home, the people had another fond little nickname for these soldiers. They called them the pracinhas. It's a warm word, a tender word, something like the little guys from the square, the ordinary young men from every town plaza in Brazil. The little guys. Remember that too. And while those little guys were getting ready, the whole country was changing behind them. This is the part of a war nobody puts in the movies, the home front. Coffee that used to sail to Europe had nowhere to go. There were shortages, rationing, blackouts in the coastal cities, so the U-boats out in the dark would have nothing to aim at. Whole towns lived with their windows painted dark. Factories turned to the war effort. A sleepy, sunlit country was pulling itself onto a war footing for the first time in living memory. And here's a thread the schoolbooks almost always cut out completely, and it makes me a little angry, so forgive me. It wasn't only men who went. Brazil sent women, too. Around 60-some young Brazilian women volunteered as army nurses and sailed to Italy with the force, the first Brazilian women ever to serve in a war overseas. Think about how bold that was in that time in that country. They worked in the field hospitals just behind the fighting, where the wounded came in off those frozen mountains. They held the hands of dying boys who were calling for their mothers in Portuguese, 10,000 kilometers from home. When you picture the smoking snakes, I want you to picture them too, the nurses, in the cold, doing the hardest work there is. Now the men were given American everything. American helmets, American boots, American rifles, American uniforms dyed a slightly different green. If you saw a photograph of a Prasinha and didn't know better, you might mistake him for a GI. Until you saw that snake on his shoulder. They had to learn a new army's whole way of fighting fast in a borrowed language of hand signals and broken English. They were green, they were rushed, and the clock was running. In the middle of 1944, the first of them shipped out. Around 25,000 Brazilians in the end would make that crossing. Imagine being one of them. You are 19, maybe 20. You have spent your whole life under a tropical sun. You get on a ship, you cross an entire ocean, and you are handed over to the United States Fifth Army in Italy to fight in a campaign grinding its way up the spine of that country, mountain by mountain, against German soldiers dug into the high rock. And the Italians and the Americans looked at these newcomers from Brazil, and at first, they did not know what to make of them. Here were these cheerful, sunburned young men, singing, calling everyone friend, so different from the grim veterans of the European front. Some of the Germans across the line heard there were Brazilians coming and reportedly laughed about it. Tropical tourists, they figured. Boys who would break and run at the first real winter, at the first real shell. They were about to learn something. The first enemy was not even the Germans. It was the cold. These were men from a country where, in much of it, you can go your whole life and never see snow. And now they were in the Italian Apennine Mountains in the worst of winter, freezing fog, ice, snow up the slopes, a wet cold that gets into your boots and your bones and never leaves. Boys who had picked coffee under a summer sky were now digging into frozen mountainsides, fingers numb on a rifle, watching their own breath, waiting. I want you to really feel that, because the history books give you maps and arrows and they forget the simplest, most human thing. These particular soldiers had to learn how to be cold. And they did. And then there was the mountain, Monte Castello. If you remember one name from this story, a student of mine once told me, let it be that one. Monte Castello was a German strongpoint up in those mountains, high ground, perfectly placed, with German guns looking straight down every path you'd have to climb to reach it. Whoever held Monte Castello controlled the valley, and the Allies wanted it badly. They attacked it, and they failed. They attacked it again. They failed again. The assaults on that mountain in the closing months of 1944 were brutal, and they did not work. Men climbed those frozen slopes into German machine gun fire and were thrown back, again and again. For the young Brazilian force, it was a bitter, bloody education. Let me walk you up that mountain the way they lived it, because the dates matter. Late November 1944, they attack. They are thrown back. A few days later, the end of November, they try again. Thrown back again. December, another push at that frozen rock. And again the mountain holds, and the snow swallows the men who don't come down. 3 times, 4 times that winter, the slope of Monte Castello beat them, and each time the stretchers came back heavier than the line that went up. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine being the soldier who climbed it in November and buried your friends, and then in February you are told, "We go again." Same mountain, same guns looking down. Some people back at headquarters began to wonder if the doubters had been right all along. Maybe the snake couldn't smoke after all. But here's a thing I learned about people in 40 years of telling these stories. You find out what someone is made of not when they win easily, but when they get knocked down on a frozen mountain in someone else's war, 10,000 kilometers from home, and they get up and climb it again. On the 21st of February, 1945, the Brazilians took Monte Castello. They held it. The mountain that had thrown them back over and over was finally theirs. And I want you to sit with what that meant for those men, the ones still standing, looking back down the slope they had failed to climb so many times. The snake had its pipe lit now. After Monte Castello, something changed. The doubt was gone. The Brazilians took the next strong points, a town called Castelnuovo, then the hard fight for Montes in the spring. And then, as the German front in Italy finally began to crack, the smoking snakes did something that still astonishes me when I say it out loud. Near a place called Fornovo, in late April of 1945, the Brazilian force cut off and surrounded an entire German division, the 148th Infantry Division, along with Italian fascist troops fighting beside them. And these were not boys. These were veteran German soldiers, the tropical tourists, the little guys, the army that would never fight, forced the surrender of the whole lot of them. When the prisoners were counted, there were nearly 15,000 of them. 2 German generals among them, almost 15,000 enemy soldiers, laying down their weapons in front of the praças from Brazil. Let me say that number a different way, so it lands. The army that an entire nation had laughed at, the snake that was supposed to never, ever smoke, captured more enemy soldiers in a few days than many people back home had ever believed it could even put on a boat. And it wasn't only on the ground. High above those mountains, Brazil sent fighter pilots, 2, a squadron flying American P-47 Thunderbolts, diving on German trains and bridges and convoys. They had a battle cry I have always loved, hard to translate, but it meant something like "go for the eyes, sink it in." These were Brazilians in the sky over Italy, hunting the German war machine from above. Snakes in the clouds. Then in May of 1945 it was over. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was finished, and the smoking snakes had done the impossible thing. They had crossed an ocean, learned the cold, climbed the mountain that beat them, and brought a German division home as prisoners. Nearly 1,000 of them, 400 and, no, let me be exact, because every one of them deserves it, 948 Brazilian soldiers did not come home. They were buried first in Italian soil, in a cemetery at Pistoia, and only later brought back across the ocean to rest in their own country, under a monument in Rio de Janeiro that still stands today, where you can go and read their names. And now we come to the ending nobody expects. Because you would think that the men who did the impossible would come home to a parade and a grateful nation and a comfortable place in the history books. Some of that happened, but here is the strange, sharp truth of it. Remember Vargas, the dictator. While Brazil's sons were dying in Italy under a banner of freedom and democracy, fighting against fascism, against dictatorship, Brazil itself was still a dictatorship. Vargas was still in power. And do you see the problem? You cannot send your young men across the world to die fighting dictators, and then look them in the eye when they come home and tell them they can't have democracy in their own country. The contradiction was too loud. It could not hold. The very soldiers who had gone to crush fascism abroad came home carrying, in their hands, the argument that ended the dictatorship at home. And within months of the war's end, by October of 1945, Getúlio Vargas was pushed out of power. The snake that learned to smoke didn't just win a battle in Italy. It helped light the fire that burned down a dictatorship in Brazil. And then, and this is the part that always made my students angry, and I think they were right to be angry, Brazil, for a long time, sort of, forgot them. The Praças came home to a country moving on, busy with its own politics, and the smoking snake slipped quietly toward the edges of the national memory. The men who had done the one thing everyone swore was impossible spent the rest of their lives watching their grandchildren learn everyone else's war, and almost never their own. So, now you know how a snake learned to smoke, but I didn't tell you this story just so you'd know a date and a mountain. I told it to you because of that patch, because of what those men did with an insult. Think about your own life for a second. Everybody, at some point, gets handed the snake. Somebody tells you, with a laugh maybe, the way the whole country laughed at those boys, that the thing you want to do is impossible, that people like you don't do that it'll happen when pigs fly, when snakes smoke, and you have two choices in that moment. You can swallow the insult and prove them right, or you can do what 25,000 farm boys and city boys from the tropics did. You can take the snake they laughed at, and you can stitch it onto your own shoulder, and you can carry it up the mountain. The next time someone tells you something can't be done when snakes smoke, they say, I want you to remember that once a whole army did exactly that. They made the snake smoke, and they did it in the snow in someone else's war while half their own country was still batting against them. That's the part the schoolbook leaves out. I'm Joaquim. If you'd like to sit with me for more of these, the stories of Brazil that the books forgot, the ones nobody taught you, then subscribe and pull your chair up to the fire. I've got 100 more, and I've been waiting a long time to tell them. And do me one favor. Down in the comments, tell me, what was your snake? What did somebody once tell you that you'd never be able to do? I read them. Everyone.